night's sleep story, The Clockmaker's Dream. Before we begin, we'll take a few moments for a gentle breathing guidance to help you settle into comfort and relaxation. If you prefer to skip ahead to the story, you can find the timestamps for each chapter listed in the video description. Tonight's tale takes us to a quiet workshop in the heart of Paris, where a reclusive clockmaker discovers a mysterious clock that whispers secrets of time, leading him to a place where the world slows and stillness brings peace. To begin, find a comfortable position, whether you're lying in bed or curled up in your favourite chair. Let your body relax fully, feeling the support of the mattress beneath you or the softness of the blankets around you. Adjust your pillows, shift if needed, and allow yourself to create a cosy, welcoming space. This is your time to let go of the day and allow calm to settle over you like the gentle rhythm of Theodore's clocks, soft and steady. Now let's focus on your breath. Slowly inhale through your nose, letting the air flow naturally, filling your chest without strain. Hold it softly for a moment, then exhale gently through your mouth, as though you're releasing a sigh that carries away the weight of the day. With each breath, feel your body growing softer, your shoulders relaxing, and your thoughts becoming lighter. Picture the rhythm of your breath like a pendulum, swinging gently back and forth, steady and comforting, guiding you toward rest. If your mind begins to wander, that's perfectly okay. Let your thoughts drift like leaves floating downstream, and return your attention to the steady rhythm of your breath or the sound of my voice. There's nothing for you to do now but rest. Allow yourself to sink deeper into this moment of calm. When you're ready, let's begin Theodore's journey, a story of gentle time, golden whispers, and the gift of stillness. Chapter 1. The Quiet Workshop. In a forgotten corner of Paris, where cobblestones hummed faintly with history and lamplight spilled in golden pools across the streets, there stood a little workshop. It was nestled between tall, quiet buildings, their facades softened by ivy and years. A faded wooden sign above the door read, "Valmont Clocks and Repairs," its edges curled with age. If one paused to listen as they passed by, they might hear a soft ticking emanating from inside, like the steady, reassuring rhythm of a heartbeat. Inside, Théodore Valmont sat at his workbench, his spectacles resting low on his nose. Around him, the workshop was a symphony of quiet sounds. Clocks of all sizes lined the shelves and walls, their hands turning in harmony, whispering time into the room. The air held the faint, comforting scent of warm beeswax and polished wood, while a single candle flickered beside him, its flame dancing with the shadows. Theodore worked with calm deliberation, his hands steady as he adjusted the gears of an ornate pocket watch. Theodore was a man of few words and fewer visitors. His days were quiet, filled with the familiar tick of his clocks and the gentle routine of his craft. Outside, the city bustled with life, but inside his workshop, time seemed to flow more gently, as though even it were unwilling to rush him. Theodore had long come to think of the clocks as companions rather than objects. Each one had its own character, its own voice. The grandfather clock in the corner hummed low and slow, like a deep baritone, while a small brass clock on the desk beside him ticked cheerfully as though sharing a secret joke. Tonight, as always, the workshop was alive with their soothing chorus. Théodore paused, looking up from his work to listen. There it was, that soft symphony, blending perfectly with the distant patter of rain against the window pane. Outside, the city was settling into its slumber, its sounds growing faint, like a lullaby played on the other side of a wall. Théodore smiled faintly, feeling at home in the stillness. He reached for a new clock, a recent commission that had caught his attention. It was unlike any he'd crafted before. Its case was made of dark mahogany, polished to a gentle shine, and its glass face glimmered faintly in the candlelight, though Théodore had not yet wound it. The clock felt different as he ran his fingers across its curved surface. He could swear it hummed softly as though waiting. A curious warmth seemed to pulse through his fingertips, almost imperceptible, like the touch of a feather. "This one has a secret, doesn't it?" Théodore murmured to himself, his voice as soft as the rain. He often spoke to his clocks when the workshop was empty. It wasn't out of loneliness, but rather the belief that every creation deserved to be spoken to kindly. He turned the clock in his hands, inspecting the delicate mechanism within. It had been delivered with little explanation, and no name on the slip of paper that came with it, only a note that read, "For the one who listens to time." He pondered those words as the ticking surrounded him, steady and serene. It was late now, later than he realized. The candle had burned low, its light a golden halo that swayed in time with the breath of the room. Théodore set the clock carefully down on his workbench and sat back, removing his spectacles. He rubbed his eyes, the gentle rhythm of the clocks lulling his mind into a comfortable stillness. The workshop seemed to exhale with him, the air heavier and warmer, as though wrapping itself around him like a favourite blanket. And then, for just a moment, the ticking seemed to shift. Théodore's eyes fluttered open, his brow creasing faintly. It wasn't louder or faster, it was simply different, more deliberate, as if the clocks were sharing a secret, a language only they could speak. He listened closely, his heart beating slowly in time with their rhythm, and as the faintest smile touched his lips, he let his eyes close again, surrendering to the comfort of it all. Outside, the rain continued its soft patter. Inside, Théodore drifted gently towards sleep, surrounded by the hum of time, steady, soothing, and alive. The candle's flame wavered and the clocks ticked on, their voices blending into the quiet of the night, singing Théodore and his little workshop into a world where time flowed gently and dreams carried no weight. In that forgotten corner of Paris, where few eyes ever looked and fewer feet ever wandered, the world held still. It was a place untouched by hurry, a place that welcomed slumber like an old friend. And as Théodore dreamed, the mysterious clock on his workbench ticked softly to itself, as though waiting for the perfect moment to share its secret. Chapter 2. Whispers in the Gears. Morning in Paris arrived softly, like light slipping through the cracks of a door. For Théodore Valmont, the gentle hum of his clocks was the first thing to greet him, their rhythm unchanged by the night. He rose slowly from his chair, the faint imprint of dreams clinging to the edge of his mind. Something golden his glass face catching the muted sunlight streaming in through the window. Though Theodore had not yet wound it, the clock seemed different this morning, as though it had spent the night waiting for him to return. Theodore turned towards the small stove in the corner, his movements deliberate and unhurried. He brewed himself a pot of tea, black with a hint of lavender, and the warm steam curled into the air like breath. The workshop smelled of wax and wood, mingling with the floral aroma, comforting and familiar. He carried the cup back to his bench, settling himself before the dark mahogany clock. Something in it called to him, though he couldn't say why. Its gears sat still, yet there was a presence to it, a faint hum in the quiet that did not match the silence of unwound time. He reached for the small silver key on his desk, fingers brushing over its cool surface. "Shall we see what you've been keeping to yourself?" he murmured. Theodore rarely rushed to wind a clock. He believed every creation had its own rhythm, its own moment to awaken. But this one was different, curious and compelling, as though it had secrets begging to be heard. With care, he inserted the key into the base, turning it gently until he felt the familiar resistance of the mechanism catching. The first soft tick rose into the air, clear and steady, like a drop of water falling into a still pool. Theodore paused, listening as the clock came to life. Its ticking was unlike any he had heard before, slower, richer, as though each movement of the hands carried weight. He leaned closer, and in that stillness, something remarkable happened. The ticking seemed to stretch, elongating into a whisper, delicate words woven into sound. Theodore froze, the workshop around him receding, his mind focusing on that faint voice. He could not quite make out the words, but the tone was unmistakable, soft, kind, and ancient, as though time itself had decided to speak. He sat back in his chair, tea cooling beside him, eyes fixed on the clock. Was it imagination? The tired trick of an aging mind soothed by too many late nights? And yet, the whispers continued, threading through the ticking, like music carried on a breeze. Theodore let his gaze drift around the room, the grandfather clock in the corner, the cheerful brass clock on the desk. All of them now seemed to tick in unison, harmonizing with the sound of this new creation. It was as if the entire workshop had settled into a singular, calming rhythm, deeper and slower than ever before. The silence that followed was nearly as profound as the sound itself. Theodore exhaled, his chest rising and falling with deliberate ease, his pulse aligned to the soft ticking. A sense of peace, warm and unspoken, washed over him. He placed the key beside the clock and leaned back, allowing the moment to hold him. The workshop seemed different now, alive in a way it had never been. The faint hum of the city outside faded to nothing, as though the clocks had drawn a curtain around this quiet little corner of the world. As the days stretched on, Theodore worked quietly, the mysterious clock ticking steadily beside him. Occasionally the whispers returned, soft fragments of sound that held no clear, assumed meaning, yet filled him with a deep, soothing calm. He thought of the note that had accompanied the clock, for the one who listens to time. And for the first time in many years, Theodore felt as though time were not something to be counted, but something to be felt, gentle, patient and infinite. The afternoon slipped past like a shadow, unnoticed, and as the light outside dimmed, Théodore placed his tools aside. The workshop was quiet now, save for the ticking of the clocks, each voice blending into one soft lullaby. He extinguished the candle, its smoke curling like a final breath, and stood by the window, looking out into the evening. Paris stretched before him, its streets washed in the golden glow of lamplight, and for a moment Théodore imagined that the entire city could hear the ticking, pulling it into the same gentle rhythm that held his little workshop. Before retiring for the night, Théodore glanced once more at the mysterious clock. Its face gleamed faintly in the dim room, as though sharing a secret smile. He touched his polished wood, a whisper of sound brushing against his thoughts. Warm and wordless, like the quiet promise of a dream yet to come. As he climbed the stairs to his small bedroom above the shop, he carried that calm with him, the rhythmic ticking still lingering in his ears. The city outside murmured softly to itself, but within the workshop, time had found its voice, and Théodore had begun to listen. Chapter 3. The Garden of Hours. Théodore awoke to the faint grey light of morning filtering through the window, casting soft lines across the floorboards of his small bedroom. The air was still, and for a moment he lay there listening. To the silence, to the faint creaks of the old building settling, and somewhere below, to the comforting, steady ticking of the mysterious clock. It was not a sound that intruded, but rather one that seemed to breathe with the house itself, like a heartbeat he had always known but never noticed. Downstairs, the workshop waited, cloaked in the quiet peace of an early day. Théodore descended the stairs, his steps soft and deliberate, and as he opened the door, the scent of wood polish and lavender welcomed him like an old friend. The clock sat exactly where he had left it on the workbench, its face glowing faintly in the dim light, as though it had been awake all night, quietly working its magic. Théodore touched its glass face with the pad of his finger, expecting only cool stillness. Instead, a gentle warmth greeted him, like sunlight lingering on a windowsill. As the morning wore on, Théodore found himself pulled outside, a rare urge for a man whose life unfolded in his workshop's familiar walls. Pocket watch in hand, he wandered through the streets of Paris, now alive with soft bustle. The chiming of church bells mingled with the distant murmur of voices, but even amidst the sound he noticed something unusual. The world felt slower, as though it moved in careful, measured steps. The path led him to a quiet place, a garden he had not seen before. Hidden down a narrow passageway, it opened into a small courtyard bathed in golden light. Théodore paused, taking in the scene. Flowers of every kind swayed lightly, their petals shimmering as though brushed with morning dew and sunlight. At the centre stood a stone sundial, its surface etched with patterns so delicate they seemed to shift under his gaze. Time had no urgency here, it existed only as a companion, gentle and unspoken. Théodore moved to sit on an old wrought iron bench at the garden's edge, watching the play of shadows and light. The ticking of the pocket watch seemed to match the slow rhythm of the garden, as though it too understood this place's quiet harmony. He breathed deeply, cool air tinged the scent of honeysuckle and freshly turned earth and let his mind settle. Each inhale and exhale grew softer, more even, and soon it felt as though the world itself was sighing along with him. For the first time in years, Théodore let his thoughts drift without purpose. He watched a butterfly alight on a violet bloom, its wings opening and closing in slow, graceful rhythm. He listened to the faint hum of bees tracing invisible patterns through the air. Time stretched around him like silk, soft and endless, and when he glanced back toward the sundial, the shadows had barely shifted. It was as though the garden had carved out a space outside the hurried world, a space where stillness could be felt as something alive. When at last Théodore rose to leave, the air seemed warmer against his skin, as though the garden had wrapped its calm round him like a cloak. He tucked the pocket watch carefully into his coat, its ticking now faint, like the sound of his own breath. As he stepped back into the narrow alleyway and the familiar streets of Paris unfolded before him, the sound of the city returned, but softer, gentler, as though the clocks of the world had slowed just enough to let him walk at his own pace. By the time he returned to the workshop, afternoon light slanted through the windows, gilding the room in pale gold. The mysterious clock sat waiting for him, its ticking as steady as before, and Théodore smiled faintly as he touched its dark wood. "Thank you," he whispered, though he couldn't say to whom. Perhaps to the clock, perhaps to the garden, or perhaps simply to the slow, quiet rhythm that had begun to weave its way through his days. He settled into his chair, and as the afternoon gave way to evening, Théodore worked with an ease he had not felt in years. The clocks around him ticked gently, their voices rising and falling like waves in a quiet sea. And somewhere beneath it all, the mysterious clock whispered on, soft and steady, as though it had always been part of his story. Chapter 4. The Keeper's Whisper. Evening settled over Paris like a soft blanket, dimming the golden hues of day into shades of velvet blue. In the quiet of his workshop, Théodore lit a single candle and watched the flame dance gently before he turned his attention to the mysterious clock. It ticked steadily, its rhythm unchanging, yet it held a presence that filled the room. Théodore had begun to think of it not as a mere object, but as something alive, a quiet companion who spoke only when the world around them grew still. As he leaned closer, resting his hands on the workbench, the faint whisper returned. It was clearer now, no longer tangled within the ticking, but rising just above it, soft, deliberate and melodic. The voice was not spoken, not like one might expect, but rather felt, threaded directly into his thoughts like words written across still water. "Come, listen, time waits for you." Théodore sat up, his pulse steady, his breath slow. He glanced around the workshop, but nothing moved beyond the flicker of candlelight on brass and glass. Slowly, almost without realizing it, he picked up the clock and cradled it gently in his hands. The hum within it seemed to deepen, resonating with the air itself, and Théodore felt a strange warmth spread up his arms, grounding him in the moment. Before he could question the pull, his surroundings began to shift. The shelves and clocks blurred, their edges softening like an image in a dream, until he stood, Around him stretched an endless field of wildflowers, swaying under a breath of wind that carried no chill. The ground beneath his feet was firm, yet felt light, as though he were walking upon the surface of a dream. Ahead, bathed in silver light, stood a figure, a man cloaked in deep blue, the fabric embroidered with tiny constellations that flickered softly like distant stars. His face was calm and ageless, his expression one of quiet knowing. "You've heard it," the figure said, his voice as smooth as a ripple across still water. Théodore opened his mouth to respond, but the man raised a hand, a gesture of quiet understanding. "Words are not needed here. You've listened, and that is enough." The figure turned slightly, gesturing toward a vast clock rising from the earth itself. It was neither brass nor wood, but something finer, shimmering like liquid moonlight. Its hands moved impossibly slow, gliding rather than ticking. "This is the Garden of Hours," the figure explained, "the place where time pauses, not to stop, but to asterisk rest." Asterisk. Théodore stood in silence, breathing deeply as the calm of the space wrapped around him. Every sound, the breeze, the faint ticking of the great clock, the rustle of flowers, wove into a harmony that seemed to slow the rhythm of his heart. The figure turned back to him, the constellations on his cloak glowing faintly. "This is your gift, Théodore Valmont. You hear time as others hear music, and through your work you offer the world a moment of stillness." The words settled over Théodore like a soft weight, one that eased rather than burdened. He nodded, his mind quiet and clear. The figure extended his hand, and in his palm lay a small silver key, not unlike the one Théodore had used before, but finer, as though spun from the stars themselves. "Take this," the man said, "a key to remind you that even the ticking of time holds peace, if one only chooses to listen." Théodore reached out, the key cool and delicate against his skin, and the world began to shift again. The starlit field blurred, dissolving like mist at sunrise, and Théodore found himself back in his workshop. The candles still burned low, the clocks ticked softly, and the mysterious clock sat before him, unchanged. Théodore looked down at his hand. The silver key rested there, real and solid, a gift from a dream that felt more vivid than the waking life. For a long while, he sat in silence, the ticking of the workshop clocks cradling him in their steady rhythm. When he finally rose, placing the key carefully beside the mysterious clock, he whispered a soft "thank you." The room seemed to sigh in reply, its peace deepening as though the very air had accepted his gratitude. Outside, the city murmured through the night, but within the workshop, time rested, and Théodore listened. Chapter 5. The Clockmaker's Gift. The days that followed were slower, softer. Théodore moved through his workshop with the quiet certainty of a man who understood his place in the rhythm of the world. The silver key sat beside the mysterious clock on his workbench, a small yet powerful reminder of the Garden of Hours and the keeper's words. The hum of the clocks around him seemed deeper now, their voices woven together like threads in a tapestry, steady and serene. One evening, as the last light of day faded into twilight, Théodore placed the key into the mysterious clock's base. With the the slightest turn, a sound filled the room. Not a tick, but a soft chime, like bells heard through layers of mist. The sound rose and fell in slow waves, carrying a warmth that seemed to melt the space around him. The candlelight flickered, and Théodore closed his eyes, breathing deeply as the air grew heavier, like a comforting embrace. Outside, the streets of Paris were alive with their quiet night sounds. Distant footsteps, the hum of lanterns, but Theodore's workshop had become something more. The clocks, large and small, ticked in harmony, as though the workshop itself were breathing. Their voices carried through the walls, not loudly, but gently, slipping into the world like whispers of peace. And far beyond, across the city, those who were restless, children caught between dreams, writers at desks with weary hands, and wanderers gazing through windows, began to hear it, the gentle rhythm, the slow, calming lullaby of time itself. Theodore's gift, born of his hands and his listening heart, now stretched invisibly into the night, offering stillness where there had been none. As the workshop grew darker, Théodore sank into his chair, his gaze resting on the mysterious clock. He no longer needed answers to its origins or its magic. It was enough to know it had found its way to him. Its ticking filled the quiet, not as a reminder of time passing, but as a promise that time, when listened to, could hold peace. Théodore let out a long, soft breath, his thoughts drifting like leaves on water. And as he sat there, his eyes slowly closing, the workshop held its stillness. Outside, Paris slumbered beneath its blanket of stars, and inside, the clocks ticked on, soft, steady, and alive. Somewhere between seconds, the garden of hours waited, and Théodore knew its door would always be open to those who chose to listen. In the end, the little workshop on the forgotten street had become more than a place where clocks were made. It had become a sanctuary, a place where time itself could rest, and where Théodore, the clockmaker,